Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe late morning to some others who are dialing in from parts unknown. Uh, Hello, I'm Tony Sorrentino. I work at the University of Pennsylvania here in the great city of Philadelphia. Thanks for signing up for this program and for taking an hour out of your day to talk about anchor institutions and this incredibly important topic, affordable housing. So we've thrown ourselves together for a couple of months between now and June. We've got 6 total sessions in that time. And each one of those sessions after today is going to get much more specific and technical and interesting with real, actual experts in different fields. We're going to have a demographer from the Pew Charitable Trusts, who is their neighborhood specialist, who's going to come in and teach us how to do community data collection. We have one of the nation's top real estate finance people explaining how they put together the money and the financing to build affordable housing. We've got a leading architect who's going to talk to us about placemaking and how we design and construct these properties so that they are beautiful and welcoming and warm. We have a variety of people coming in. We have a professor from Arizona State University who specializes in case studies. And we have a sociologist and planner, Lance Freeman, formerly of Columbia, now Penn, who is probably the nation's leading authority on gentrification and housing. So we've put together a nice program, and I think we're going to learn a lot. It's very informal. I hope we have a lot of fun with it. These hours are going to be broken down kind of a third, and a third. The first 15 or 20 minutes, the guest will do a talk. Today, that'll be me. I'm going to walk us through some high-level slides about the history of the anchor institution movement, where we are, and kind of begin to segue into affordable housing, which will be for next month. Then we're going to do some breakout rooms. Caitlin has the ability to just do randomized breakouts. I'm going to give the group a question. And so whoever has signed up will get broken into groups of 2 or 3 or 4. The randomization theory is, if we were at a conference, we'd all go to the coffee pot, we'd exchange business cards, we'd meet each other. Let's do that online. I'm not going to let you pick your groups, nor am I going to assign them. Every time we get together, it's going to be random, and you should grow your network of great colleagues across the country. And then the final, 10 minutes or so, you'll identify somebody in your small group to kind of maybe report out and represent how the group thought about the question that was posed or topic that you were asked to debate. So that's kind of the gist of it. We are going to dive into the topic now. I'm going to share my screen and walk you through some of this. I'm assuming most people work at anchors, are pretty familiar with anchors, so it's not going to be 101, but it's not going to be like super high level. We're going to try to keep it at a good, simple pace. And so I'm going to ask someone for a thumbs up. Caitlin, we can see the screen. We are good. So we're going to just kind of dive right in. And so, the anchor movement's been growing. It's not anything I need to tell people in this screen. We have nearly 1,000 members in one organization alone, the Anchor Institution Task Force. But there's also the Coalition for University Metropolitan Democracy Collaborative. There are think tanks out there that do this work. The ICIC model is quite known. At Penn, at the Netter Center, we have the Anchor Institution. We have the Netter Center that has written an Anchor Institution toolkit. There's a lot of resources out there that have grown rapidly over about 15, maybe 20 years. As a movement in society and in city planning and urbanism, it's kind of embryonic. It's kind of young, but interesting kind of nonetheless. And so there have been 3 moments that I want to kind of bring people, 5 moments that I want to bring people through. There's 3 on this screen, there'll be 2 on the other, just to kind of orient us all in the history of the relationship between a college, university, higher ed, large nonprofit, and a challenge in society at the time. Because that's really what the anchor movement's about. We as anchors don't get to decide what the urban challenges is. All we get to decide is how we react to it and how we use our resources to perhaps enhance or improve society. So, this is going in the Wayback Machine, but in the 1860s, when the Morrill Act was created, that basically created the land grant institution. There may be some of us on the call today from one of those land grant institutions. This is a historic marker from Iowa, who claims to be, one of the earliest, if not the first. And what the land grants did was they built this kind of inexorable link between the regional economy in a rural area and the college or university. They did that by enhancing the liberal arts education that was standard in the day by adding more industrial, technical, or agricultural education. And that was kind of a pre-professionalism that really allowed the education to get refined and kind of sand off the edges. And people were graduating back into their farms, back into their factories, and it was building this kind of link. That was the real first example of it. If we leap forward 50, 60 years, the urbanization movement in America, the industrialization, really brought a lot of overcrowding to cities, a lot of environmental challenges. There was a huge influx of immigrants to the United States from Europe, from all around. There was a great migration from the south to the north, which was industrialized. This did create some socioeconomic challenges. There were some ills that came along with that. There were amounts of poverty, people experiencing homelessness, not great conditions. Universities, believe it or not, in the 20s and the 30s, this is a picture from Northwestern University, by the way, around 1914, started doing these kind of urban lab models based off the settlement house movement, in which they would go out into the community with faculty and staff to do direct service delivery in education, in health, and social services kind of writ large. This was the idea of coming out of the ivory tower into the neighborhoods, get off campus, leverage your intellectual and human capital to do that. If we go to the post-war era, 40, 50 years later, 30 years later, we're coming out of World War II, an era in which there was almost no infrastructure development in the United States and its cities. And so there was a great degradation of the physical character. This is actually a picture of my neighborhood. This is West Philadelphia after an era of urban renewal to make way for university expansion, kind of a real original sin of town-gown relations in Philly and at Penn. What you started to see was this real influx to Penn and Drexel and others in Philly, but we see it at Columbia, Hopkins, USC, Chicago. The GI Bill added a lot of students. They needed dorms, libraries, classroom spaces. Federally sponsored research, the NIH, the NSF, these are all new concepts that come out of World War II. We have to grow our labs. So the physical footprints of universities are growing. And if you're in a tight, compact urban city and you're surrounded by some blight, not to say nothing of some horrible racist practices that went along with redlining at the time, this was like a powder keg. And the town-gown tensions really became exasperated by the kind of the urban renewal movement. So those are those three things. Coming out of that, I like to point out to people that in those cities and in the rural parts of the country, there's something really going on here. That graph on your left that slopes down, that's the number of labor workers in America from 1941 into the early 2000s. You could see it. It's just an incredible dive down. And the loss of manufacturing as those jobs went overseas or they closed down, or enhancements in technology made the labor pool less needed as machinery and computers were more efficient. For a comparison's sake, on the right-hand side, I show you a graph from Philadelphia. Those are the number of manufacturing jobs lost from the 50s up into the early 21st century. And on the right is the growth of what we would call eds and meds jobs. You could see this kind of inverse relationship. We were a big industrial city that has become an eds and meds city. So I just wanted to give it to you. Each one of your towns probably has a similar graphic. And as we get into these sessions and we talk about data, I want you to start thinking now and encourage you now to begin exploring what data you may find about job growth and job decline in your cities by sector, and start being curious. What is the growth of eds and meds in my town? What is the role of the anchor institution? So I promised you two other examples, and this kind of brings us to modern day. We live now from the 90s up until the present with kind of an interesting kind of two-pronged approach to the anchor strategy. There's been this incredible growth in the professionalization of anchors that come out of the 90s. It really starts with HUD. Henry Cisneros, who was the HUD secretary under President Clinton, began this concept that there could be an office of university partnerships. In the early to mid 90s, it was a great idea. How do you connect HUD resources with these large institutions, and how do they leverage each other? That could be in service learning or community partnerships. It could really be about the physical enhancement of the neighborhood itself and how one engages, service delivery around healthcare and education. That was interesting. We had things like Campus Compact and Kumu come out of that. There's a little cover of a report there above the Kumu graphic that the state institutions, the land grants, began studying whether or not they were making an impact or not. So there was this kind of professionalization, both in the work and in the evaluation. And on the right-hand side, we talk a little bit about neighborhood revitalization. This is another kind of approach. And it's the university as a developer. I've been very involved in that work at Penn. My colleagues at Harvard and Hopkins, Chicago, others, Michigan, who've seen this as well. You become almost campus planning as urban planner, and you have to understand the scale between your campus and your neighborhood. A lot of times, because of that degradation of the neighborhoods that we talked about before, by the 90s and the 2000s, there's a lot of blight that requires some removal. A lot of these universities are saying, look, the neck we're saving is our own. We're not a competitive institution if we're living in a community that is degraded. Community policing, how do you improve retail corridors? Can you get the private sector to build an apartment building or a grocery store or, a bookshop? We, all started to ask ourselves, how do we leverage our own spending as procurers of goods and services? How do we leverage our own hiring practices as an HR department? Are we hiring local and diverse? And then we also began to measure, just like the ones on the left, states were interested in measuring how the anchors were doing as land grants. A lot of institutions began doing their impact reports. So these are just a couple of examples. We got interested in clean and safe services, the university supplementing municipal services, street cleaning. There's examples. Hopkins was doing neighborhood planning as a university. Penn was doing economic impact reports. The one in the middle, Portland State's been in this for a very long time. Really interesting work around placemaking, architecture, design, and planning. So there's kind of these movements. I give you 5 kind of over time. And so we live now with these frameworks. All of us on this call are in one form or another. Give credit to where credit is due. One is created by a think tank, the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. It's created by Michael Porter at Harvard years ago, and the Democracy Collaborative, which many of us probably know. 2 think tanks, very much in the same vein, very much with the same goals, but approaching the role of the anchor slightly different. The Initiative for a Competitive Inner City really talks about the anchor engaging with the private sector to create jobs, income, and wealth. And the way that they think about that is, there's an economic role to this. Like I was mentioning before, the hiring, the purchasing, the training. Also, universities or anchors, whatever they may be, they own land or they have access to land. And they can become real estate developers themselves. They can engage in joint ventures with the private sector, or they can lease that land to a private sector developer to attract kind of private income, private investment, new infrastructure, and new amenities. And one of the advantages of that is its money's not diverted from a university away from, say, libraries or cancer research centers or athletic facilities, for an off-campus real estate. You leverage the land you have, but someone else takes the risk of financing it, designing, and constructing. They pay you a fee for the land that you're on. That got very hot in the 2000s. And then lastly, they do see themselves in a public role, kind of building a community infrastructure. But it's really about a private sector, almost institutional private partnership. On the Democracy Collaborative, they really see the anchor kind of leading almost in a day-to-day way of making it their mission to be in the kind of direct services part of it, and really a focus on the low-income households that are around them and measurement of that. Let's not just build something and pray it works. Let's keep measuring and evaluating how we're doing on economic development and procurement. Are we getting into affordable housing? This separates them a little bit from the other agenda item. Other things that help build community, the arts and culture. Are we standing up civic groups where they don't exist? What about the youth? Are we evaluating how they're doing? Are we paying attention? And then the idea of safety as well. So these things kind of come together. They're separate, but they share commonalities. And the question is, which one is the right one? Well, it really depends on where you are in the country, where you are at a city or in a rural area. You're responding to challenges that are before you. I could tell you in the days at Penn, when we began this work, a major response was crime. We were going through a really difficult time. A lot of cities are having crime right now. Should the anchor be playing that role? As I mentioned before, you don't always get to choose, but you have to respond. These days, I think we're all realizing that there is the affordable housing crisis that we have to get into. So I wanted to just tee that up a little bit with some information for you all that I pulled together about affordable housing in this country so we can just start to get ourselves framed up and we start to stitch together what is an anchor, what is its role, what role can it play, what should it aspire for? And now the challenge before us in this country where we have 23% of American renters are spending more than half of their income on housing. This is really extreme burden on people. This is very intense. But this kind of breaks out this chart, giving you some of the estimated number of renters and their kind of income levels. It's really becoming a challenge, not just in the cities, but in the rural parts. And of course, this is tied to jobs and it's tied to income and salaries as well. They are not divorced or separated. This gets a little bit into the issue of race and income, and it's a little bit of a complicated graph. I hope it's not too wonky, but I pulled these from some pretty good sources on the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Just the idea that households of color are just more likely than white households to be rent burdened. And you start to see it kind of play out. And so the bottom lines there on those bar charts are showing race. And then the top ones are showing kind of a renter. And then when you see the gridded line, that's your rent burdened people. These are people who are extremely low income. We're talking back-breaking abject poverty, which is challenging, and we have a fidelity to them in some way. And so you can kind of see those numbers there. And so does an anchor play a role when they're faced with these kinds of conditions next to their campuses? And this is just another kind of way of looking at it. Geographically, across our country, I grabbed some data from the winter of 17, so 2 years before COVID, 2.5, kind of right up till COVID was coming to an end. A lot of disruption kind of in our country back then. But this is a consumer price index for rent, primary rent. So you could just kind of see rent going up kind of everywhere. And then on the right-hand side, I don't know if I pulled it off or not, but I wanted to show by gradation where it was most pronounced. The West Coast has got some serious issues kind of going on when it comes to the cost of housing. We know this by following the news and whatnot. I was surprised to see the Northeast was low there because cities like Boston and New York City have some of the highest costs in the United States. But anyway, I wanted to give this as just kind of a high level summary. So we put these things in a national and a geographic context. So that brings us right up to about 220-ish, right? Caitlin, I think I'm doing okay. And what I wanted to do is get us into some breakout rooms just to get the juices flowing and to get you thinking about the work that you do in the context of what it means to be an anchor, as well as what these issues are that we're going to grapple with over the next 6 months around housing. So I have a question that I kind of quickly pulled together that there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. This is just a teaser to get you thinking. And so take this down, do a snapshot of it, whatever it is, but you're reflecting on your anchor institution and the frameworks that we just laid out, right? That public-private framework and a kind of direct social services framework. When you think about them, they're both valuable, they're both good. But if you're going to be an anchor institution that has to do affordable housing, is one more valuable to you than the other? And that answer could be dependent on the kind of anchor institution you are, which I'd love for you to get into because hopefully you represent a variety in your different breakout groups. But the goal here, let's say the goal is as Anchor Institution, we want to increase the supply of affordable housing near our campuses. Now that you've seen these frameworks and you've looked at some of the challenges and you know that there are rent burdens out there, I don't know, let's break out into groups. I'm going to pop in here and there and meet people, but let's take, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. I'm showing 2:22. I don't know, maybe 2:32.
It'll close automatically.
Oh, it
Yep.
will.
So,
Okay,
yep, I have a time set.
perfect. So let's do that and meet each other, introduce each other, build your networks, chat a little bit about where you are in the country, what kind of institution you're at, reflect on this. No right or wrong answers. Please identify a person in your group who doesn't mind speaking out on what you talked about, what you learned, different issues, what you think might work for what kind of institution. There's no monolithic answer here. So let's do that. We'll break into groups and then we'll all get back together again in around 10 minutes. Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Okay, assuming they are in their breakout rooms.
Yep, everybody's been assigned breakout rooms. There's a few folks who haven't joined their rooms yet. Oh, they're popping in.
Okay, cool. All right. Hopefully that went okay for 22 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think it's good.
Awesome.
Really good.
So I get to just click on that little join button if I want to pop in
Yeah,
and
if you want to pop into any rooms. Yep.
see if I know anybody. What I find so interesting, Caitlin, is the geographic distribution. People just all over
Mhm.
the place.
Yeah.
Is that common for Compact to have that?
It depends. Like
Okay.
sometimes some of our stuff is very heavy with like the Northeast.
Yes, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is great. And I didn't know if when we come back, I didn't want to interrupt your
No,
flow,
that's okay.
but Janine has some good comments in here. I didn't know if you wanted to speak to any of those in the chat, just about
Okay.
systemic racism,
Yeah,
and relates with everything you're talking about.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and so you can pop into any of these rooms. You just click the join
Okay.
button on the list there.
Great. And then when I can pop out just as easy, I think.
I think to pop out, you just join another room,
Got it.
I think.
Perfect.
If you're having issues, just send me a message.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna do my first one.
Okay, good luck.
Hey. Cool. Welcome back. Hopefully that was a good opportunity to meet some folks around the country who are interested in this topic, who do this kind of work. And like I said, these breakout rooms are designed to build a little network, meet each other, ask and answer questions, and also to um, understand the challenges that are before the industry, um, depending on where you are in the country, or depending whether or not you're in a rural or an urban setting. Um, this was just a very modest exercises to get the juices flowing. And so we were broken into a couple of groups, and I know we're going to do a little bit of questions at the end, but I figure let's take 10 minutes or so, a minute or so per group, to kind of just report out on what you talked about, what you learned about, some insights that you may have gained. As I was popping into groups, I was specifically saying to folks, look, there's a couple of frameworks, ways to approach this. Simply put, maybe the anchor institution is the builder of affordable housing. If you can build a dorm, why can't you build affordable housing unit? The other alternate is let's not divert those resources away from the core mission of the university. I don't think some people would say building affordable housing isn't the mission. Let's work with a private developer or a nonprofit developer to kind of bring that amenity that we recognize that we need. So I wanted to get those juices flowing before we kind of went any further. So with that, I guess we can go, Caitlin, in order of 1 through
1
whatever,
through 6.
1 through 6. So hopefully somebody will volunteer just to read out a little bit what you chatted about, talked about, insights learned, basic stuff. So group number 1, have at it.
Oh, I think that's a
Hi there.
anybody else wants to do this, that's cool too. Honestly, we spent time introducing ourselves and talked a little bit about the housing, but not terribly much. And I think that there's 3 of us on there who were from small liberal arts institutions that are all undergoing budget crises and all sorts of stuff. And then someone from an institution that had like ample funding. And so their anchor work was working great. Ours is working less great.
Okay. It's interesting. Yeah, I think that the size and scope of an institution and its resources for this absolutely matters. And some institutions are land rich and cash poor and say, well, why don't I put my land in and see what we can do there with a partner? Others will say, well, I've got land and money, I can do it. We can do it ourselves. So there's can sometimes be different options. Okay, so group number 2, somebody had volunteered, I thought I saw in the chat.
Yeah, we got cut off right before we were deciding who was going to
Ah.
speak. So I decided I can do it for our group. We also did something very similar. We spent some time just getting to know each other. The thing that was kind of interesting is we've got folks from higher ed, but also some nonprofits that were working with anchor institutions. So that was great to hear what they're doing. But we all kind of had different ideas of who and what the affordable housing was for. So some were looking at affordable housing for their students. Others are looking at affordable housing for their employees, and like because of the nature of where their institution sits and the high rents for them, that people can't even live and work in the same area. And then my institution, and I think there was at least one other, is really looking at affordable housing for our community. So the community that we're a part of, how can we be part of the solution in making affordable housing more? We didn't get to any strategies.
Yeah.
We more just got talking about what our organizations are doing around the different types of populations that we're looking at when we're thinking about affordable housing.
That's fantastic. And I think this is an essential subject as we go around to different parts of the country and think about it. I popped into one group and was mentioning that there are institutions in our nation that are in really charming college towns that are high demand places to live. And it's an issue of workforce housing, that there are people who have to live 100 miles from the campus because they're not making the kind of salary where they can live and walk to work or be close to work. And that is going to have an impact on the quality of people that you can attract. So there is this link and relationship between a quality workforce, healthy workforce, and income and housing. And it's become kind of a microcosm of our country and society today. So I love that we're going to get into the population for whom to build. For a lot of universities, it's not the students, but for some it is. And we have to be realistic about that. Okay, group number 3. Was there a group number 3?
Yes, there was. If you're not sure what group number you are, I'm going to
Okay.
read who is in group number 3 and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Abby Kell, Dylan Rexroth, Haley Broadhead, Kelly Westland, Kim Dean Anderson, and Rachel Wenrick were in group 3.
So if there's a volunteer or two who wouldn't mind kind of reporting out on what you discussed, that'd be great. If
can
there
go.
are no,
I can go.
oh, hey, Rachel.
So we did, we spent a lot of time introducing ourselves, but I would really love to shout out Kelly, whose university is doing some really interesting things in Wisconsin with land trusts. And Dylan was talking about GW converting a dorm to a shelter.
Wow.
There's some things we talked about. Yep.
That is amazing. That one
Thanks,
I've not
Rachel.
heard of. It's incredible. Land trusts are coming up, you know, and we're going to get into what land trusts are as we get further into this session. We have a real estate finance expert who's going to come in and talk about that a little bit, and how land can be set aside for affordability and perpetuity. And then the structures on top of it can kind of change and people can come up, but the land itself stays affordable. This idea of converting is really an impressive idea and a bold idea. And in GW, in a city like Washington, where housing can be expensive, that's quite a gesture. Great. Thank you so much for that, Rachel, for reporting out. I think group number 4.
Yep, I've
group I may
got group number
talked to.
4.
Hey,
I'm
Sarah.
Sarah from Amherst College, and I'm going to try to build on some of the themes that have already been mentioned because our group covered many of the same things. Our group talked a little bit about the values of the institution. So one of the schools talked about the importance of social mobility and educational opportunity when it comes to affordability, and the tension that sometimes exists with developers or private partners. And so oftentimes there are strings attached when doing these kinds of partnership projects, and it can be tough to navigate those relationships. It's important to be clear about the goals in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Are you housing students, workforce, community members? And the group seemed to be interested in a hybrid approach, that it's not one or the other, but both, if not more, things need to be addressed. We also talked at the end about the importance of understanding housing in the area, more of a regional approach, because there are a lot of people in communities thinking about housing. And so being a part of a community and having those relationships so you know what the real need is and what role an anchor institution might play is helpful.
That's fantastic. I think we're going to get into all of these things a little bit later too, which is great. Whether it's the demography of who's in the community and how to assess what population can afford what kind of housing, that kind of market analysis, how the market responds to that, how an anchor might respond to that. Really very interesting. Hybrid is something that probably could work. There are some cities that require, when a new apartment building to be built, a certain percentage is set aside for affordability. We have that in Philadelphia. 20% of any new building has to be set aside for people making an area median income of, say, 50%. We're going to get into those terms and those kinds of things throughout the session. All right, so group number 5, please. If there's anyone from 5 that would be willing to report out, that would be awesome.
I think that was us, Chad. I see that your camera on, so jump in if I missed anything. We spent most of our time doing introductions, and what really struck me is that we are all from a variety of different institutions, some with enrollment challenges, some with in that enrollment is declining, others with enrollment growth. We had a community college that was housing refugees that were being bused to Chicago and kind of experiencing this influx of migrants who needed emergency housing, and the school was using a gymnasium to do so. Mary had shared that. It also sounds to me like a lot of the folks in our breakout group are involved in convening different stakeholders around different community development initiatives. Marquette is working on a multi-anchor partnership. So Rana had spoken to that. And so I think my takeaway is just that there are challenges look different at different types of institutions. We discussed urban versus rural, but I would say one of the threads is just the university or the college using its power to convene and using its built infrastructure as a resource to meet some of the challenges.
That's great. I like that idea that you've introduced about the role and the responsibility. And I think that's something that has to come up when putting together a case to go to your president of your anchor or a leader of some sort to say, we have to do something and here's why. And here's what our role could be. Before we leave, I know I want to get to some comments that Janine put in the chat as well. I mean, that there is a historic and deep element of racism that's tied to housing in this country, especially in the mid 20th century, but not just then. It goes back to reference she makes to federal land being stolen from indigenous people. And a lot of the land grant institutions run into that. That is a very deep topic that goes into the 1860s. But 100 years later, in the 1960s, eminent domain was being applied in urban settings. So it's another form of the federal government kind of taking land and being turned over to the private market. And in some cases, those were university numbers. College. That has a big please. Maybe somebody can volunteer to pop in and just say this is what they kind of went after. But if not, no pressure.
Are you asking for group 6, Tony? You broke up a little bit there at the end.
Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes. Is there a group 6 that has anyone who can report out? And if not, we can just kind of go into a
Hi, this is
into kind of a
Brenda.
wrap.
I'll
Wait,
start,
Sophie,
but
I see something.
this is Brenda, but others can
Oh.
jump in. To like group 5, I think it was, we also spent most of the time just kind of getting to know each other and not doing the assignments. Sorry, there's always that one group, isn't there?
No, you're
Who
good.
doesn't follow the rules. But just sharing kind of some projects and other things that others are working on as well too. And how my organization is a community partner that's located at a university, and so we work kind of across universities trying to address this issue as well too. So just eager to learn from this group moving forward. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, so I'm going to let my other colleagues in group 6 add any other comments if they have any.
I wanted to, Brenda, both you and Jason were do a good deal of research. And I think one of the interesting things that you raised was, having anchor institutions deliberately have a housing impact assessment built in as different elements. And then another thing that had come up that I'd appreciated hearing about was sort of thinking about anti-displacement as a anti-homelessness framework as well.
Wow.
And yeah, appreciated how
Those
that
are fantastic.
conversation.
Those are really, really great topics. This idea of a housing assessment, the impact assessment, is not something that universities do enough of. And that kind of research, if we could learn from each other during these sessions over the next couple of months, that will be great. I'll try to find examples to share as I send out information on Google Docs and whatnot. Maybe we can build that into the kind of template we put together for a case study by the end of these sessions. But I think that's really great, a really important tool. We do a little bit of it, but I'd love to see what other models are that are out there. We study changing rents, we study changing populations, who's coming in and who's coming out, education level, income level, mostly data you can get from the census, but we're also doing surveys, door-to-door surveys. And that qualitative research really matters and gets at issues that can be much more significant than just the raw data from a census bureau report. All right, so that brings us up. Was there anything that anyone wanted to talk about in this group that we did not get into, that we've got a couple of minutes before we wrap up? I think if you showed a hand, we could try to. Brenda, go right ahead.
Yep, sorry, I'm very shy, as you can see.
Yeah,
The other, and I'm sorry, I haven't looked at the full laundry list of topics that we're talking about, but we are the part of the representing Rhode Island as part of the National Zoning Atlas project that has started. I don't know if Sarah Runnan or others will be involved in these conversations, but it's a really interesting tool that's developing across the country. They're looking at land use and zoning and how it impacts development in general, not just housing and affordable housing, but just something to put on the list of resources. And Sarah's affiliate was at Yale and now at where the heck is Sarah? Cornell. And so it would, I'm sure she'd be happy to come on to share with our colleagues as well too. So just something to add to the list if you haven't already.
I'm going to do that. I'm going to make sure that gets around. For those of you that don't know, this is I was playing with it the other day. It's really interesting. This kind of first national zoning atlas where I was playing in the state of Montana of all things, where I was trying to see what was going on there. Not a lot of affordable housing being built in Montana, but also not a lot of density being built in Montana. Really devoted to this idea of an acre per house kind of thing. But this is a really fascinating tool that we should all become familiar with. And maybe I'll have the person from the Pew Trusts who's going to do neighborhood demography, make sure she's up on it. She's terrific. And she can touch upon that as a tool that we can learn how to use. But in the meantime, I'll make sure the link goes out so it's free so people can kind of play with it. So that'd be fun. Thank you for that. That's awesome. Were there others that had any suggestions or questions about next week or topics that we didn't get into today that you'd like this group to discuss? Hearing none, I think we'll just kind of wrap up. Thanks for spending some time with us. We're going to get together again in about a month. You've got the list of dates. There'll be a link that comes to you in the calendar if you don't already have it. We'll make sure you get them the day before. The week before. We're going to send out reminders. A week before, you'll get the name of the presenter, their biography, links and articles. I'm going to set up a Google Docs, or we've set up a Google Docs where there'll be folders for each of the 6 sessions. So we'll drop materials in there. I'll do a wrap up from today, drop some stuff in the first one, like the National Zoning Atlas link, for people to look at. And that article from the Washington Post on what GW is doing and converting a dorm to a shelter. Fascinating. Hopefully this becomes just kind of an informal group of colleagues who are interested in the topic, who care about the work of the anchor world, want to learn more, and we can become resources to each other. Hopefully people meet and have conversations in between these meetings and build out their network. That's how I met Rana from Marquette many years ago, and we've stayed in touch all these years. So I'm glad to see you, Rana. And same with Bill Cook. And so I think I've just met Michelle on something not long ago with the Anchor Institution Partnerships, the idea of collaborations. So it's a really fascinating field. It mirrors society in an interesting way. Anchors are neither the government nor are they the kind of total private sector, but something in between. And as housing becomes more than a bit, housing becomes a legitimate crisis in this country. What is the role of these institutions? What is their responsibility, as we got into before? And then what resources do we have at our disposal to try to make a positive impact? So that's really what we're going to do over the next 6 months, 6 sessions. So this was fun. Confession, I've never done this before. So thanks for not yelling at me in the chat or kind of zoning out or making hand gestures that were inappropriate. Thanks to Caitlin for getting this all organized and keeping us on the straight and narrow. And hey, there's Joanne from Drexel. Hey, how are you? My neighbor to the north of Penn. So great. So good to see you. We've got a listserv that was set up that you all got this information from. Send us emails. Caitlin's looking at me like, thanks. Now I've got 80 emails to read. But that's what it's there for if you need to respond. But like I said, the idea is to build a team that we can share best practices with or questions. I think when a movement's being built like this, and I do think it's being built still, you have to kind of study its arc to understand its significance. And anchors are maybe kind of coming to the peak of their arc. It's only about 20 years old in a way. But the housing thing is just getting off the ground. And you can only really study these things over time to understand it. So as people get into it early, we're all going to learn kind of from each other. It's the one thing I love about this work is I don't necessarily feel competitive, that we are competing for anything. We're not competing for students or land or, tenants or faculty member. Well, maybe some faculty, but that's a different beast. But the anchor exists as a kind of planning tool in towns. So in the aggregate, I think we, not to get too kind of crazy, but we make the country better. So have a great weekend. And I hope to see you all when we do this next month. Thank you.